Stray dog refuses to leave sick baby alone. What happens next is heartwarming. How do you think this story will unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. It was one of those mornings where the world seemed heavy. The air was cool and still, with an eerie quietness that hung over the narrow alleyways of a small town. Life here was often quiet at dawn, with only the sounds of rustling trees and distant footsteps breaking the silence. But on this particular morning, something was different. In a small, forgotten corner of the town, beneath the shadow of an old crumbling building, a stray dog sat. He wasn't like the others who roamed these streets, dogs who scavenged scraps and barked at strangers. This one was different. His fur was matted and dusty, with patches of brown and black streaked by dirt and time. A red collar, frayed and faded, still clung to his neck, hinting at a past life, one of love, one of family. The dog, who would later come to be called Buddy, wasn't concerned about food or shelter that day. His focus was on something else entirely. Beneath a makeshift blanket, half hidden in the shade of the alley wall, a faint rhythmic sound could be heard, a child's shallow breathing. The baby lay motionless, her tiny body wrapped in worn cloth that had once been white. Her face, pale and flushed, twitched slightly as she slept, her breath uneven. She couldn't have been more than a year old. Alone, vulnerable, and weak, the baby was a heartbreaking sight. Buddy had found her the night before, drawn to the faint sound of crying carried on the wind. He had followed his instincts, trotting through puddles of rainwater and weaving through the maze of abandoned streets. When he finally discovered her, alone, cold, and shivering in the dark, something inside him shifted. Buddy wasn't just a stray dog anymore. He was a guardian. That night had been brutal. The rain had poured relentlessly, soaking through the baby's blankets and chilling her fragile body. Buddy had curled around her, his thin frame pressed tightly against her side as though willing his own warmth into her tiny form. Despite the storm, he hadn't moved, and as the first light of morning crept into the alley, Buddy stayed by her side, his amber eyes watching for any sign of movement. He knew he couldn't leave her. Something deep inside told him that if he left, even for a moment, she wouldn't survive. Hours passed, and the streets slowly began to wake. The occasional sound of a car engine echoed in the distance, followed by the chatter of townsfolk on their way to work. Buddy's ears perked up with every sound, his body tense as he waited for someone, anyone, to notice them. But no one came. It was then that Buddy made a decision. He stood, shaking the stiffness from his limbs, and gently nosed the edge of the baby's blanket, as though to reassure her. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake, her small fists clinging to the fabric around her. Buddy turned toward the mouth of the alley and started walking. He didn't go far, just far enough to stand at the edge of the street, where he could be seen. His amber eyes scanned the road, his tail low and still. When a woman passed by, her arms full of groceries, Buddy barked, a sharp, deliberate sound that made her pause. She glanced at him, startled. Stray dogs weren't uncommon here, but something about Buddy's bark caught her attention. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't wild. It was urgent. "Shoo!" she said, waving him off. "Go on." But Buddy didn't move. He barked again, louder this time, his gaze fixed on the woman with a desperation that only he could understand. The woman hesitated, frowning as she looked more closely at him. There was something in his eyes, something pleading, and for a brief moment, she felt her heart tug. But her rational mind dismissed it. "It's just a dog," she muttered, shaking her head as she hurried down the street. Buddy watched her go, his tail drooping slightly, but he didn't give up. Over the next hour, Buddy tried again and again. Each time someone passed the alley, he barked, trotted toward them, and then darted back toward where the baby lay, as though trying to lead them. But no one paid him any mind. It wasn't until mid-morning, when the sun began to climb higher in the sky, that someone finally listened. Sarah Thompson, a young teacher from the nearby elementary school, had always been an animal lover. On her way to work that day, She noticed Buddy almost immediately. She saw him standing at the edge of the alley, barking at a passing car. His coat was dirty, his ribs faintly visible beneath his fur, and yet there was something about him that made her stop. Sarah pulled her car over to the side of the road, her curiosity piqued. "What's wrong, boy?" she called as she stepped out, shielding her eyes from the sun. Buddy barked again, his tail wagging slightly as he turned and darted back toward the alley. Sarah's brow furrowed as she watched him disappear into the shadows. "What on earth?" she murmured, following him cautiously. As she stepped into the narrow alley, her breath caught in her throat. First, she couldn't see anything. The sunlight didn't reach this far back, and the shadows were deep and cool. But then she saw him, Buddy, sitting beside a small bundle on the ground. Sarah's heart stopped. "Oh my God!" She rushed forward, falling to her knees as she peeled back the edge of the blanket. Her hands trembled as she uncovered the baby's face. Pale, flushed, and far too still. "Hey there, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, you poor thing." The baby stirred faintly, her lips parting as she let out a soft, breathy sound. "She's alive," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Tears filled her eyes as she gently scooped the baby into her arms, cradling her against her chest. The baby's body was cold, far too cold, and Sarah could feel her tiny heartbeat fluttering weakly beneath her fingertips. "We need to get you help," Sarah whispered, pressing a kiss to the baby's damp forehead. She glanced at Buddy, who sat beside her with his tail thumping gently against the ground. He looked at Sarah, his amber eyes full of something she couldn't quite describe. Relief, maybe, or hope. "You saved her," Sarah murmured, reaching out to stroke his head. "You really saved her." Buddy leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly as though he finally felt safe. Sarah stood, cradling the baby tightly as she hurried back toward her car. "Come on, boy," she called over her shoulder. "You're coming with us." Buddy didn't hesitate. He trotted after her, his ears perked and his tail wagging slightly as though he knew the hard part was over. As Sarah buckled the baby into the back seat of her car, she glanced at Buddy, who had already hopped into the passenger seat. He sat calmly, his gaze fixed on the baby as though refusing to look away. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "I don't know how you did it," she whispered, "but you're a hero, you know that?" Buddy barked softly, his tail wagging. Sarah smiled faintly as she started the car, her hands still trembling. "Hold on, little one," she murmured to the baby. "You're going to be okay." As the car pulled onto the road, Buddy lay down beside the baby's seat, his head resting on the edge as he watched over her. Sarah glanced at them in the rearview mirror, her heart aching at the sight. "This world doesn't deserve dogs like you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And as they drove toward the hospital, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the town. It felt like hope, like the promise of a new beginning. For the first time in days, Buddy closed his eyes and let himself rest, knowing that the baby was safe. The drive to the hospital felt like the longest of Sarah's life. Every glance in the rearview mirror sent her heart racing. The baby, though wrapped snugly in blankets, still looked far too pale, her tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Sarah kept whispering reassurances, not only for the baby but for herself. "You're going to be okay, little one," she murmured. "Just hold on." Beside her in the passenger seat, Buddy sat quietly, his amber eyes fixed on the child as though he understood the gravity of the situation. It was as if he knew he couldn't relax just yet. Sarah kept glancing at him, marveling at the silent determination etched into his face. "Where did you come from?" she muttered under her breath. "You're more than just a stray, aren't you?" The road seemed endless, but finally the hospital came into view. Sarah pulled into the emergency entrance and slammed the car into park. Without wasting a second, she scooped up the baby, cradling her gently but tightly, and ran toward the glass doors. "Help! Someone help!" she called, her voice echoing through the nearly empty lobby. A nurse rushed toward her, alarm flashing across her face as she saw the child in Sarah's arms. "What happened?" the nurse asked, already guiding Sarah toward a nearby stretcher. I found her. Well, this dog found her, Sarah stammered, her voice trembling. She was alone in an alley. She's cold, and she's not breathing right. The nurse didn't waste time with questions. She pressed a button on the wall, summoning a team of doctors and nurses who immediately began working on the baby. Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding as she watched them carefully place the infant on the stretcher, wrapping her in warm blankets and checking her vitals. From the entrance, Buddy barked, a short, sharp sound that broke through the commotion. Sarah turned and saw him standing just outside the glass doors, his tail low and his ears pulled back. It was as though he was afraid to come inside but couldn't bring himself to leave. Is that the dog you mentioned? The nurse asked, following Sarah's gaze. Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Yes, he led me to her. I think he's been watching over her all night. The nurse's expression softened. Animals have a way of knowing, don't they? Sarah looked back at Buddy, who was still standing in the doorway, his eyes locked on the baby. Can he come in? She asked hesitantly. The nurse hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Just for a little while. But we'll need to keep him calm. Sarah hurried back to the entrance, opening the door and crouching down to Buddy's level. Come on, boy, she said softly. She's safe now, but I think she still needs you. Buddy stepped forward cautiously, his paws clicking against the tile floor as he followed Sarah inside. The hospital staff glanced at him curiously but didn't say anything. There was something about the way Buddy carried himself, calm, focused, and gentle, that made it impossible to turn him away. Sarah led him to a corner of the waiting room where they could sit. Buddy lay down at her feet, his eyes fixed on the doors that led to the emergency room. He didn't whine or pace. He simply waited, his entire body tense as though he was willing the baby to be okay. Hours passed. The sun rose higher in the sky, and the hospital grew busier as the morning rush began. Sarah stayed with Buddy the entire time, occasionally reaching down to stroke his fur. It was comforting for both of them. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, pulling down his surgical mask as he approached Sarah. Her heart leapt into her throat. Is she okay? She blurted out, her voice trembling. The doctor smiled faintly. She's stable. We're warming her up and monitoring her closely. But she's a fighter. You got her here just in time. Sarah let out a shaky breath, tears springing to her eyes. Thank God. The doctor hesitated for a moment, glancing down at Buddy, who was watching him intently. Is this the dog you mentioned? Sarah nodded, wiping her tears. Yes, he wouldn't leave her. I think he saved her life. The doctor knelt down, reaching out to scratch behind Buddy's ears. You're a hero, aren't you, boy? He said softly. Buddy wagged his tail once, his amber eyes still focused on the door. Will the baby be okay? Sarah asked. The doctor stood, nodding reassuringly. We're running tests, but we think she's just malnourished and hypothermic. Once we stabilize her, we'll call social services to investigate. Sarah's heart sank slightly at the mention of social services. She knew it was necessary, but the thought of the baby being shuffled into the foster system made her ache. Can I see her? She asked. Not just yet, the doctor replied gently. But we'll let you know as soon as she's ready for visitors. Sarah nodded, glancing down at Buddy. What about him? The doctor smiled faintly. I think he's earned a visit, don't you? An hour later, Sarah and Buddy were led into a quiet room in the pediatric wing. The baby was lying in a hospital crib, her small body swaddled in a warm blanket. Her color had returned slightly, and her breathing was slow but steady. Buddy approached the crib cautiously, his ears perked and his tail wagging softly. He placed his paws gently on the edge of the crib and peered inside, his amber eyes full of wonder and relief. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny fingers twitching as though she could sense his presence. Sarah smiled, tears filling her eyes again. She knows you're here, she whispered. Buddy let out a soft, contented whine, his tail wagging harder. For the first time since Sarah had found him, he looked truly at peace. The days that followed were filled with hope. The hospital staff quickly became enamored with Buddy, who refused to leave the baby's side. Nurses brought him blankets and bowls of food, and doctors marveled at his calm, gentle demeanor. Word of the hero dog spread quickly, and soon, reporters began showing up at the hospital, eager to tell his story. Sarah stayed by his side through it all, acting as his unofficial spokesperson. He saved her, she told every reporter who asked. If he hadn't found her, I don't think she would have made it. One day, as Sarah sat with Buddy in the waiting room, a nurse approached her with a clipboard. "The baby's awake," the nurse said, smiling. "Would you like to see her?" Sarah's heart leapt. "Yes, please." The nurse led Sarah and Buddy back to the baby's room. When they entered, Sarah saw the baby lying in her crib, her eyes open and bright for the first time. She was still small and frail, but there was a spark of life in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "Hey there, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, stepping closer to the crib. The baby blinked up at her, her tiny lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. Sarah glanced at Buddy, who stood beside her with his ears perked and his tail wagging. "Look, Max," she said softly. "She's going to be okay." The name slipped out before Sarah even realized it, but as soon as she said it, she knew it was perfect. Buddy, no, Max seemed to agree. He let out a soft bark, his tail wagging furiously as he leaned closer to the crib, as though to say, "I'll always protect you." Sarah smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You really are a hero, Mac," the baby gurgled softly, her tiny fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. Max lay down beside the crib, resting his head on his paws as he watched over her. And in that quiet moment, Sarah knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. The hospital room grew quieter as the days passed, but the bond between Max and the baby only grew stronger. Each morning, Sarah would arrive early to check on both of them. By now, Max had become a fixture at the hospital. Nurses smiled warmly at him as they passed, slipping him scraps of food or a gentle pat on the head. "He's really something special, isn't he?" one nurse said to Sarah as she stopped by to check the baby's vitals. Sarah nodded, glancing at Max, who was curled up protectively beside the crib. "I don't think he's just a stray," she murmured. "I think he has a purpose. Like he's been sent here for her." The nurse smiled. "You might be right. Sometimes animals have a way of knowing things we don't." Sarah couldn't stop thinking about that. She had seen plenty of dogs in her life, but none like Max. His devotion, his quiet strength, it was almost human in a way. Every time she looked into his amber eyes, she felt like she was seeing something deeper, something more. But the mystery of where Max had come from still lingered. And as the baby grew stronger, Sarah began to feel a tug in her heart. She knew that eventually social services would step in, and the baby would be taken into their care. It was the right thing to do, but it didn't make it any easier. One morning, as Sarah sat beside the crib, watching the baby sleep, a soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see a tall man in a gray suit standing in the doorway, holding a clipboard. "Miss Thompson?" he asked politely. Sarah stood, her heart sinking. "Yes, my name is Tom Reynolds. I'm with Child Protective Services," the man said, stepping into the room. "We've been contacted about the child you brought in." Sarah swallowed hard, glancing at the baby. "She's doing much better now," she said softly. "The doctors say she'll be okay." Tom nodded, scribbling something on his clipboard. "That's good to hear. I'll need to ask you a few questions about how you found her, and then we'll start working on placing her with a foster family." Sarah's heart clenched at the words, foster family. She knew it was necessary, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the baby, her baby, as Sarah had come to think of her, deserved something more. She glanced at Max, who was watching Tom warily, his ears pulled back slightly. "She wouldn't be here if it weren't for him," Sarah said suddenly. Pointing to Max, he found her. He wouldn't leave her side. Tom paused, glancing at Max with a curious expression. "Is that so?" Sarah nodded. "He stayed with her through the storm. If he hadn't led me to her, I don't think she would have made it." Tom crouched down, holding out a hand to Max. "You're quite the hero, aren't you, buddy?" he said softly. Max sniffed Tom's hand, his tail wagging slightly. "You don't see that every day," Tom muttered, straightening up. "I'll make a note of it." Sarah couldn't help herself. "What happens to her now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tom sighed, tucking his clipboard under his arm. "We'll do our best to place her with a loving family, but it'll take some time. For now, she'll go into temporary care." Sarah nodded, her chest tight. She glanced at Max, who was still sitting beside the crib, his eyes fixed on the baby as though he understood every word. "What about him?" Sarah asked quietly. Tom frowned. "The dog? Yes, he's been with her this whole time. I don't think he'll leave her." Tom hesitated, glancing between Sarah and Max. "Well, he's not exactly part of the case," he said carefully. "But if you're willing to take responsibility for him, I don't see any harm in letting him stay with her." Sarah's heart leapt. "Really?" Tom shrugged. "Like you said, he saved her. Maybe she needs him as much as he needs her." Sarah smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "Thank you." Over the next few days, the hospital began preparing for the baby's transfer to temporary foster care. Sarah spent as much time with her as she could, holding her, singing to her, and making sure she knew she was loved. Max stayed by her side the entire time, his amber eyes watching her every move. On the morning of the transfer, Sarah arrived at the hospital early, her heart heavy. She knew this day was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. When she walked into the baby's room, she found Max lying beside the crib, his head resting on the edge as he watched the baby sleep. "Hey, Max," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside him. "Today's the day, huh?" Max lifted his head. His ears perked as he looked at her. There was something in his eyes, something sad and knowing, that made Sarah's throat tighten. "She's going to be okay," Sarah said softly, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. "We made sure of that, didn't we?" Max leaned into her touch, his tail wagging faintly. A short while later, Tom arrived with a nurse, carrying a small car seat. The baby was awake now, her bright eyes blinking up at the unfamiliar faces around her. She let out a soft coo, her tiny hands reaching for the blanket wrapped around her. Max stood up, his body tense as he watched them carefully lift the baby from the crib and place her in the car seat. He whined softly, his tail drooping as though he understood what was happening. "Easy, boy," Sarah whispered, placing a hand on his back. "She's safe now. They're going to take care of her." But Max didn't look convinced. He sat beside the car seat, his amber eyes fixed on the baby as though silently begging her not to leave. "I'll keep an eye on him," Sarah told Tom as they carried the car seat out of the room. "He can stay with me." Tom nodded. "That's probably for the best. He seems pretty attached to her." Sarah followed them outside, with Max trotting quietly beside her. When they reached the car, Tom carefully placed the car seat in the back and closed the door. Max sat down on the pavement, his ears pulled back and his eyes locked on the baby through the window. Sarah crouched beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "She's going to be okay, Max," she said softly. "You did your job. You saved her." Max let out a soft whine, his tail thumping gently against the ground. As the car pulled away, Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks. She watched it disappear down the road, her heart aching in a way she couldn't quite explain. Beside her, Max sat silently, his gaze still fixed on the empty road. "Come on, boy," Sarah whispered, wiping her eyes. "Let's go home." Max hesitated for a moment before standing and following her. As they walked back to her car, Sarah glanced down at him, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. "You're a hero, you know that?" she said softly. Max looked up at her, his amber eyes full of something deep and unspoken. Sarah smiled faintly as she opened the car door and let him climb inside. As she drove home, the sun began to rise, casting a warm, golden glow over the town. And for the first time in days, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that the baby would find a loving home, hope that Max would finally find peace, and hope that somehow their paths would cross again. The days after the baby's departure were strangely quiet for Sarah. The house, which had briefly felt alive with purpose, now seemed empty. Max, who had once been the embodiment of energy and determination, had changed too. He spent most of his time lying by the front door, his ears perked as though he were listening for something or someone. "Max," Sarah said one morning, crouching beside him. "She's safe. Remember? You did everything you could." Max looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with a sadness that tugged at her heart. He hadn't been the same since the baby left. In a way, neither had Sarah. She couldn't stop thinking about that little girl, about how fragile and alone she had been, about how Max had refused to leave her side. And then there was Max himself, a stray dog who had appeared out of nowhere and saved a life. How did he know? How did he find her? These were questions she couldn't answer, but they haunted her all the same. One day, unable to sit idly any longer, Sarah decided to do something about it. She grabbed her coat and car keys, whistling for Max to follow her. He perked up slightly, though his tail wagged only once. "Come on, boy," she said softly. "Let's go find some answers." Sarah's first stop was the shelter. She had called ahead to see if anyone was looking for a dog like Max, but the woman on the phone had told her to come in so they could scan him for a microchip. The shelter smelled of disinfectant and dog food, and the sound of barking echoed off the walls as Sarah walked inside with Max at her side. He stayed close to her, his amber eyes darting nervously around the room. "Hello," a cheerful woman said, stepping out from behind the counter. "You must be the one who called about the stray." Sarah nodded, smiling faintly. "This is Max. He's been with me for a few days now, but I don't think he's just any stray." The woman crouched down, holding out her hand for Max to sniff. "Hey there, buddy. Aren't you handsome?" Max sniffed her hand cautiously before sitting down, his tail thumping once against the floor. "Let's see if you have a microchip." "Huh?" she said, pulling out a small handheld scanner. She waved it gently over Max's back, pausing every few seconds. Sarah held her breath, half hoping for a beep, half hoping for silence. After a moment, the woman shook her head. "No chip. Looks like he's a free agent." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I thought as much." The woman straightened up, studying Max thoughtfully. "You said he led you to a baby?" Sarah nodded. "He wouldn't leave her side. I don't know how he found her, but he saved her life." The woman's face softened. Dogs have an incredible sense of loyalty. Sometimes they seem to know things we don't. Maybe he was meant to find her. Sarah glanced down at Max, who was sitting quietly at her feet, his eyes fixed on her. "Yeah," she said softly. "Maybe he was." "Are you planning to keep him?" the woman asked. Sarah hesitated. The thought had crossed her mind more than once, but she hadn't let herself say it out loud yet. "I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like he's still waiting for something, or someone." The woman smiled gently. "Sometimes animals choose us. If he's meant to stay with you, you'll know it." Sarah nodded, her heart feeling heavier than before. She thanked the woman and left the shelter, Max trotting quietly beside her. The next stop was the police station. Sarah wasn't sure why she went there. Maybe she hoped they would have some record of a missing dog, or even some connection to the baby. She explained the story to the officer at the front desk, who listened patiently before shaking his head. "Sorry, ma'am," he said. "We don't have any reports that match your description. But it sounds like that dog's a real hero." Sarah smiled faintly. "Yeah, he really is. Have you thought about keeping him?" the officer asked, echoing the shelter worker's question. Sarah glanced down at Max, who was sitting calmly beside her, his eyes scanning the room as though he were looking for something or someone. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I think he's still looking for her." The officer frowned. "The baby?" Sarah nodded. "He hasn't been the same since she left. It's like he knows she's out there, and he can't rest until he finds her again." The officer leaned back in his chair, studying Max thoughtfully. Dogs are loyal creatures. If he feels connected to her, he won't forget her easily. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "That's what I'm afraid of." The days turned into weeks, and life slowly settled back into a routine. Max remained by Sarah's side, following her everywhere she went. He was a good dog, calm, loyal, and surprisingly well-behaved. Sarah had never seen a dog so intuitive, so aware. But he never stopped waiting. Every morning, he would sit by the front door, his ears perked and his gaze fixed on the street as though he were expecting someone to appear. Every night, he would lie down with a sigh, his amber eyes filled with a quiet sadness. One evening, as Sarah sat on the couch with Max curled up at her feet, she finally said it out loud. "I think she's yours," she whispered, running her fingers through his fur. "You found her, you saved her, and now you can't let her go." Max looked up at her, his eyes soft and knowing. Sarah's throat tightened. "I don't know if we'll ever see her again, Max, but if we do, I promise, I'll make sure you're there." Max let out a soft whine, leaning his head against her knee. Several months later, Sarah's phone rang unexpectedly one afternoon. She glanced at the number and frowned. It wasn't one she recognized. "Hello. Hi. Is this Sarah Thompson?" A woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is Sarah. My name is Emily Brooks. I'm with Child Protective Services. You brought in an abandoned baby a few months ago, and I've been handling her case." Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. "Is she okay?" "She's doing wonderfully," Emily said warmly. "She's been placed with a foster family, and she's thriving. But the reason I'm calling is, well, it's about the dog." Sarah blinked. "Max?" "Yes. We've been told about the role he played in saving the baby, and we thought you'd like to know that the family fostering her would love to meet him. She's been asking for him. Well, as much as a toddler can ask for someone." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "She remembers him?" "Animals make an impression," Emily said gently. "We think it might help her transition if she can see him again." Sarah glanced down at Max, who was sitting beside her. His ears perked as though he could sense the conversation. "When can we come?" Sarah whispered. The following morning, Sarah could hardly contain her nerves as she loaded Max into the car. He sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked up and his tail wagging slightly as though he knew something special was about to happen. "Today's the day, buddy," Sarah whispered, scratching behind his ears. "We're going to see her." Max let out a soft bark, as though he understood every word. The drive to the foster family's home was quiet. Sarah's thoughts raced as she wondered what would happen. Would the baby recognize Max? Would Max recognize her scent? Would seeing each other again bring closure, or just reopen wounds? When they pulled up to the small, cheerful house, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. A woman with warm eyes and a kind smile stepped out onto the porch, waving at her. "You must be Sarah," the woman said as Sarah climbed out of the car. "I'm Emily, the caseworker. Thank you for coming." Sarah smiled nervously. "Of course. Is she here?" Emily nodded. "She's inside with her foster parents, and they're excited to meet you. And him." Sarah opened the passenger door, and Max jumped down eagerly. His ears perked as he sniffed the air, his body tense with anticipation. "Easy, Max," Sarah said softly, holding his leash. "Let's take this slow." Emily led them up the porch steps and into the house. The moment they stepped inside, Max froze. His nose twitched, his ears stood straight up, and his amber eyes darted toward a playpen in the center of the living room. There she was. The baby sat in the playpen, surrounded by colorful toys. She looked stronger now, her cheeks rosy and her bright eyes curious as she stared at Max. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then the baby let out a delighted squeal, her tiny hands reaching out toward him. "Doggy!" she cried, her voice high and sweet. Max's tail started wagging furiously. He let out a soft bark, pulling slightly against the leash, as though he couldn't get to her fast enough. Sarah glanced at Emily, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead. Let him see her." Sarah unhooked the leash, and Max bounded forward, stopping just short of the playpen. He sniffed the baby carefully, his tail wagging so hard that it thumped against the floor. The baby giggled, reaching through the bars to touch his fur. "Doggy," she said again, her voice full of joy. Max licked her tiny hand gently, his amber eyes soft and full of love. He lay down beside the playpen, his body pressed close as though to shield her from the world. The baby clapped her hands, her face lighting up with pure happiness. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she watched them. It was as though no time had passed, as though Max and the baby had always belonged together. "She remembers him," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Emily nodded, wiping at her own eyes. "She does. It's amazing, isn't it? Animals have a way of leaving a mark on us, even when we're too young to understand." The foster parents, a kind-looking couple, stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. The woman smiled warmly. "We've heard so much about him," she said softly. "He's a hero." Sarah nodded, smiling through her tears. "He really is." The baby, still giggling, patted Max's head clumsily. He let out a soft huff, his tail wagging steadily. For the first time in weeks, Sarah saw him completely at ease, completely happy. Over the next hour, the room filled with warmth and laughter as Max played gently with the baby. He followed her everywhere, his nose never more than a few inches away from her. When she toddled across the room, he stayed close behind, ready to catch her if she fell. "She's so much happier with him here," the foster father said, watching them. "It's like he brings her peace." Sarah smiled, though her heart felt heavy. "They belong together," she murmured. Emily glanced at her, her expression soft. "You know, the foster family has been talking about adopting her. It's not official yet, but it's looking very likely." Sarah's heart swelled. "That's wonderful. They've also expressed interest in keeping Max," Emily added gently. "If you're willing, that is." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Max?" The woman nodded. "They think he's part of her story, part of her healing. And after seeing them together, I can't say I disagree." Sarah looked at Max, who was lying on the floor with the baby sprawled across his back, her tiny hands gripping his fur as she babbled happily. Max looked up at Sarah, his amber eyes calm and steady, as though he knew exactly what was happening. Her throat tightened. "It's not up to me," she whispered. "It's up to him." The decision wasn't easy. Over the next few days, Sarah wrestled with the idea of leaving Max behind. He had been her constant companion, her silent protector. She had saved him just as much as he had saved her. But every time she thought about it, she remembered the way Max looked at the baby, the way his entire body relaxed when he was near her. "They're meant to be together," she whispered to herself one evening as Max lay at her feet. "I can't stand in the way of that." The next morning, Sarah made the call. The day of the final goodbye came quickly. Sarah drove Max to the foster family's house, her heart heavy in her chest. Max sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked as he stared out the window. "Today's the day, buddy," Sarah said softly. "You're going home." Max turned to look at her, his amber eyes filled with understanding. It was as though he knew exactly what was happening. When they arrived, the baby was already waiting on the porch, her face lighting up as soon as she saw him. "Doggy," she squealed, reaching out her arms. Max's tail started wagging furiously as he jumped out of the car and bounded up the steps. The baby's foster mother scooped her up, holding her close as Max nuzzled her gently. "He's going to be so loved here," the woman said softly, smiling at Sarah. "We promise." Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to smile back. "I know. He belongs here." Max turned to look at Sarah one last time. He stood still for a moment, his amber eyes locking with hers. It was as though he was saying thank you, as though he was telling her goodbye. Sarah crouched down, scratching behind his ears one last time. "You did good, Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved her, and now you get to watch her grow up." Max licked her hand gently before turning back to the baby, his tail wagging as he followed her into the house. Sarah watched them disappear inside, her heart aching and full all at once. She knew she had done the right thing. Max had found his purpose, and so had she. As she climbed back into her car and drove away, the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the town. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of peace. She had saved Max, Max had saved the baby. And in the end, they had saved each other.